If you guys don't mind, I'd rather speak this way. I don't like speaking from behind a podium. It separates you from the audience. And besides, I think better when I'm on my feet. My favorite band is AC/DC. The lead singer, Angus Young, has a line I like, and that is, I'm a rotten guitarist when I'm standing still. And I fully believe that that applies when you're speaking as well. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself, about my company, and then talk about all of the things that we've touched on already, focusing on the economic impact and the exciting opportunities with respect to what Canada is doing with cannabis. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation. I'm a Montreal boy, so this is a homecoming. My background, before I got into the medical cannabis business, I spent my whole career in the global biopharmaceutical industry, working for the World Medical Association and for companies like Pfizer and Bayer and Eli Lilly and Amgen. And when I was first approached to get into the medical cannabis business in 2014, it was a former colleague of mine in the pharmaceutical industry who reached out to me and said, I want you to get involved in this company. He was sitting on the board of a medical cannabis company, and I said, get serious. I do serious things, important things. I work on cancer drugs and new medicines for mood disorders and multiple sclerosis. And he goes, no, listen, what I want you to do is go and search up the data that exists on the use of medical cannabis in the management of a wide range of health conditions, symptoms. Read that, and then read about the endocannabinoid system. This is the system of receptors in the brain and the body that bind only with cannabinoids, the active pharmaceutical ingredients in cannabis. And so I did. And it was the first time I experienced something wonderful about this business. I was delighted to find out that I was 100% wrong. Absolutely delighted. And a light bulb went on over my head because I've worked in every therapeutic category in medicine, and I'm well aware of the vast unmet medical need that exists with respect to symptom management across so many conditions, from pain management to mood disorders to bowel disease to multiple sclerosis and epilepsy. And so it made sense to me immediately. So I got into the cannabis business, much to my astonishment. And Aurora was a little company when I joined them 2 years ago, March of 2016. I joined Aurora. We had 35 employees. We had a market capitalization on the stock market of about $70 million. Fast forward to today, we have 800 employees around the world and a market capitalization somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 billion. And we are leading the world in terms of opening up opportunities with respect to medical cannabis first, and then soon legal consumer cannabis. And I'm the chief corporate officer, and I'm having the time of my life. And the reason why is it's a number of things. One, we are literally inventing a brand new global industry in real time, and Canada's leading the way. That's fascinating. Two, I get to experience people with knowledge and experiences that are so vastly different from my own. And at Aurora, we've created something very special. It is a hybrid company culture, a hybrid of suits like me, who come from mature industries, and people who come from the cannabis culture. And it is a remarkably harmonious thing, and it's all about learning from each other. That's one of the things that I've enjoyed the most, is learning from the people who come from the cannabis culture. And you wouldn't think that a bunch of suits and people from the cannabis culture could actually get along, but we've created something very special and unique. And it's set off by one thing in particular, one thing in common, and that is a sense of mission. A sense of mission. There is a practical idealism at work that is animating. And after spending 20 years doing what I thought was pretty important work, always with a sense of mission, I'm doing something that I really feel good about. And everybody at my company, at Aurora, feels the same way, no matter whether we are cannabis culture people or mature industry people. We feel that sense of mission, that we're doing something good, that we're part of something big, bigger than ourselves. And if you take a look at it, it starts with medical cannabis and opening up new alternatives for people who have not been able to achieve sufficient relief with standard pharmaceutical therapies or who had intolerable side effects. It starts with that. But now with the legalization project in Canada, we can feel good about doing something even better, even more important. We are looking at cannabis straight on and realizing that scientifically, this is a reasonably benign substance, a more benign substance than tobacco for certain, a more benign substance than alcohol for certain. If you take a look at the toll that alcohol has on individuals' health and on society at large, cannabis is a more benign substance, so we're putting it in its proper place, in its relative place. But perhaps more importantly, we are doing what Tahira was just speaking of, and that is we're righting an historical wrong. When cannabis is criminally prohibited, the negative impacts of that fall wickedly disproportionately on people of color, on Indigenous people in Canada, and on the poor. There is a cynical joke that maybe some of you have heard that's been around for a few years, and that is that cannabis has been legal for white people for a very long time. The practical implication of that means that, you know, if the police were to spot a Caucasian person who looked middle class using cannabis, I've seen it happen myself. They'd be told to put it out, take it away, but there would be no criminal sanctions. That is not the case historically with respect to visible minority communities in Canada and the poor, and particularly in Canada, Indigenous people. So we're righting a historical wrong. We are opening up a new way of looking at a substance that's been with us all along, where Canada has one of the highest rates of use in the world. And we are also creating a huge business opportunity where Canada is the lead. So let's talk about the economic implications a little bit. And I was listening with great interest to the presentations by our two professors of economics, and I have to say, you've got your work cut out for you, because cannabis will upend all your expectations. It cannot be compared to tobacco. It's very different from tobacco. It can't be compared very closely to alcohol as well, even though that might be the best model that we have, given that it is a legal, mild intoxicant that adults can use responsibly. It is so different for a number of reasons, and I'll just touch on a few of them. The first use that people are aware of for cannabis is dried flower. Some of us, certainly not me, who used cannabis in the past, would have most likely received it in a baggie, right? A few grams in a baggie. And that's the experience that perhaps most people have had with cannabis. But in fact, the black market for cannabis is very different. It ranges from people selling baggies out of the trunks of their cars to something remarkably sophisticated. We have a gray market, for example, in Vancouver and Victoria. British Columbia has dispensaries that have been around for years. These are cannabis retail shops, and some of them are simply, frankly, excellent. Absolutely excellent. I have friends now who are dispensary owners in Vancouver, and the quality of the customer care they provide, the range of products they offer, and the passion that they feel about their work is really admirable. And so I want you to stop thinking, if you're still thinking about cannabis as dried flower or buds, start thinking about what we see in Colorado, Washington, California, because that already exists, that market with sophisticated products that are professionally branded and shrink-wrapped, normalized products. That already exists in Canada at the dispensaries available in multiple cities across the country. So we talk about vape pens, which look like an electronic cigarette, and they contain products that contain formulations of cannabis oil that we're, as Canadian licensed producers, not allowed to produce just yet. And that's something we need to address, because the federal government and the provincial governments are making some errors with respect, in my view, with respect to cannabis legalization. It's not worth panicking about. There is time to evolve. I know it will happen, but we do need to point the way and encourage them. So very, very sophisticated consumables, edible products, everything from chocolates to capsules, a very, very wide range. And one of the most attractive segments of the market is cannabis-infused beverages. And so I've met with a company recently based out of Washington State that produces cannabis-infused beverages that are going to give beer a run for its money. And I'll tell you why. Because these cannabis-infused beverages, just picture a bottle of soda, but these have no calories. They're basically flavored waters. There's no taste or smell of cannabis at all. It's a lemon lime, or it's an apple cider, or it's an orange-flavored beverage. There are even beer-flavored beverages that taste exactly like they're supposed to, and they contain nothing but cannabis that stays in solution, and it's been formulated to have rapid onset of action. Now that's really important. Because if you think back to when cannabis was first legalized for consumer use in Colorado and Washington, there was a spate of visits to emergency rooms. And virtually 100% of the time, the reason why that happened was that people, for the first time, people who were cannabis naive, used ingestible forms of cannabis. Now, briefly, for those of you who don't know, and I hope most of you already do know this, but when cannabis is inhaled, either smoked or used via a vaporizer or a vape pen, it has a rapid onset of action. It starts to work very quickly because it's absorbed by the lining of the lungs. And it has a short duration of action. It'll last maybe an hour or two. Now, when it's ingested, it's a different story. It has a delayed onset of action, and this is problematic. It can take an hour or two, depending on how big you are, how much you've had to eat, how recently. It can take an hour or two for the effects, whether medical or consumer, to kick in. And it can last for a long time. It can last for 8 or 10 hours. And that's one hell of a commitment to being high. You're not doing a lot after that. So the cannabis-infused beverages that are starting to really take the market by storm are specially formulated to have rapid onset of action and a shorter duration of action so that they can be considered more like a beer, like an alcohol product. It's a very clean, different approach. And if you think about the range of products available in the cannabis sector, you will get an idea as to how big the economic opportunity will be. Why we can't compare it to tobacco, which is used one way, and by the way, that way, when it's used as directed, it's a deadly product. It's crazy. It can't even compare it to alcohol, because alcohol tends to have one effect. Whether you have beer, wine, or liquor, it has one intoxicant effect. That's not the case with cannabis. Any cannabis connoisseur that you speak with will tell you that different strains with different levels of cannabinoids and the terpenes, which are the aromatic compounds that give each strain its distinctive smell and taste. And by the way, the terpenes seem to operate together with the cannabinoids, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, in what's known as an entourage effect. And that seems to have impact both for medical use and for consumer use. So some strains, some products will be stimulating. And you'll find people, for consumer purposes, will use it when they're social, when they get together with friends. Whether they drink it, eat it, smoke it, vape it, they'll look for something that's stimulating. And they'll laugh a lot, and they'll have great conversations, and they'll do it that way. In other cases, some people want to have a slight sedating effect, so some products will give you that sedating effect. If you are staying home, you want to watch a movie, maybe you want to sleep. It's a very, very different spate of opportunities that we're seeing. And that's part of why I believe that the global cannabis sector will end up dwarfing brewing, for example. In addition, we don't have, no matter what some people might say at 5 p.m. on Fridays, there's no such thing as medical beer. But emphatically, there is medical cannabis. Medical cannabis. It's a problem for the federal government, and I was fascinated by the discussion that we had earlier with respect to taxation of it, because one of the things I love about my job is I am not just a businessman. I am that. I work for a for-profit company. It's my plan to work with my colleagues at Aurora to go global even more than we are and to be the biggest cannabis company in the world. That will make me very happy. But something else that makes me happy, and the reason why I love my job so much, is that I get to, in this business, unlike any other industry I can think of, I get to be not just a businessman, but an advocate as well. So I get to advocate for patients. I get to advocate for the things that are devoutly to be wished for, such as righting the historical wrongs, getting people pardoned for possession and even other non-violent cannabis crimes, fixing our society in ways that are important. And one of the things that I'm passionate about is that medical tax. Because the federal government has said that they are going to tax medical cannabis exactly the same as consumer cannabis. Now, how fair is that? How right is that? Medical cannabis is received via a prescription you get from your doctor. It is the only prescription medicine for which any tax applies. You get a prescription for a heart medicine or an opioid, by the way, and it's tax-free. There's no excise tax, and there's no GST or HST. With cannabis, the federal government has said, we're going to tax them exactly the same. Whether you use it to manage chronic pain, whether you use it to manage chronic pain because you have had a dependence problem with opioids, doesn't matter. They don't care. They're going to tax it exactly the same way, and that's outrageous. And you know what? The thing that I like about this issue, about fighting this issue so much, is that it doesn't affect Aurora at all. It doesn't affect the industry. It's a flow-through cost for us. But it affects the patients, and we know these patients, unlike my time in the pharmaceutical industry where you don't get to know the patients. In fact, it's illegal. We can have back and forth relationships. I've become friends with our patients, and I know what their struggles are. I know the burden of chronic illness that they deal with, whether it be pain, whether it be epilepsy, whether it be a crippling mental illness. I understand what they're going through, and a lot of these people are already living in income-constrained situations. And to add an additional tax burden on top of them is outrageous, and it's particularly outrageous for the reasons that a gentleman I respect a lot, Bill Blair, has said. Bill Blair has done great work on this file, the former chief of police in Toronto. He's done amazing things, and the federal government in Canada deserves a lot of credit for what it's done with a much more rational attitude than the past with respect to cannabis, but they haven't gotten everything right. And one thing that they've gotten wrong, and I've heard it out of Bill Blair's mouth a number of times, is that if we tax consumer cannabis, but not medical cannabis, people will fake it. They'll lie to their doctors. Doctors will write prescriptions, and people will lie to get in the medical cannabis system. You can't make that kind of assumption. You cannot start with that kind of assumption. And you certainly can't do that without even testing the proposition. It is wrong to do so. That presupposes that people will lie, that instead of going down to the cannabis shop and purchasing their products or ordering it online and having it delivered, that they're going to try and save $2 or $3 a gram by gaming the system. That presupposes that the 300,000 Canadians who currently have a prescription for medical cannabis in our system today are liars. And it presupposes that doctors are going to be complicit in this, and they're going to put their licenses at risk in order to help people get prescriptions for their recreational cannabis. It's BS, and we need to tell the government when it's BS. Now, there's lots of BS in this business. There's lots of assumptions that are hard to make. I would challenge a number of the conclusions that our economist professor guests here have come up with, and it's not their fault. It's not their fault at all, because nobody knows. Nobody knows what the future market is going to look like. Nobody knows how big it's going to be, how to tax it, what the consumer's behavior will be. But we have some pretty good guesses, and we have some indications from the U.S. Jurisdictions. Now, one thing before I forget that I did want to address is whether or not we're going to have a shortfall in supply in the Canadian consumer market initially, down the line, and what to do about it. And one thing I can tell you that we don't want to do as a country, we don't want to be importing cannabis. Not only do we not want to be importing cannabis from other jurisdictions, there's nowhere else to get it. Because Canada's so far ahead of everywhere else in the world except for those US states, 29 US states with legal medical, 8 states plus DC with legal consumer, and they're not allowed to move it across even state boundaries, so they can't move it across national boundaries. So I would suggest that we don't want to be planning to import. And the reason why is this. If there's one thing that we need to do overall with respect to cannabis policy is have patience. Have patience. Because the picture will become clearer over time, as our friends in Uruguay, who have led the world, by the way, and can we just pause and have a round of applause for that? So let's have some patience. That doesn't mean don't put pressure where it applies. That doesn't mean stopping advocacy or activism with respect to cannabis. But let's have a degree of patience until the picture becomes a little bit clearer. But one thing that we can anticipate is that it's possible initially, right after consumer legalization, which I'm betting $5 will be in September, not July, but only $5. Only 5. Could be later than that. When it happens, will we have a shortfall in supply? Potentially, for a short period of time. But here's the thing, and let me throw some numbers at you. Aurora is the second largest cannabis company in the world by revenues and by market capitalization, and we are growing like a what? Yeah. This industry is also the world's #1 source of bad puns. Did you know that? So we're growing incredibly fast. And in terms of just one company's capacity, we currently have licensed capacity, that is licensed by Health Canada, of, let's say, licensed to sell 4,800 kilograms a year. 4,800 kilograms a year, yep. Licensed to sell. But we've got 5 facilities in Canada already. We've got 2 in the Montreal area. We've got 1 in Saskatchewan. We've got 3 in Alberta. And by the end of this year, our license capacity will be 150,000 kilograms per year, 150 tons. By the end of next year, Aurora's global capacity, including the million square foot facility that we're building in Odense, Denmark, will be 430,000 kilograms per year. So the pace of building is enormous. And in fact, we don't even have 80 or 90 licensed producers in Canada. We now have more than 100 that have been licensed. So the capacity in Canada going through the roof. The most important thing to remember, and I'm just about to wrap this up so we can get into a group discussion. Most important thing to remember here and take a lot of pride in is that Canada's leading the world. We are leading the world in good public policy. We're leading the world in achieving a social benefit and a certain measure of social justice. We're leading the world in inventing a new industry, and it's going to transform this country for the better. Because companies like Aurora are creating massive investment. We have already invested hundreds of millions of dollars into Canada's economy, and now into countries like Germany, Italy, Denmark, Australia. We're growing around the world. So massive investment, massive economic development, spin-off economic development. We have partners that we're working with in Canada and around the world, partner companies, in which we've invested tens of millions, and in some cases even more than that, of dollars. And we're helping them succeed in spin-off, associated, ancillary businesses like cannabis extraction and hemp, which is a wonderful global market, particularly because it's a great source of plant-based, non-animal-based protein, which is, for which demand is exploding internationally, especially in Asia. We're invested in all these things. So it's investment, it's economic development, it's employment, and it's great employment. It's everything from entry-level work as harvesters to people who require, in our company, advanced degrees, MAs and PhDs in science. And it's about innovation. It's really about innovation. The things that we're doing, that we're bringing to the world. We're innovating in public policy. We're innovating in the science. Our facilities alone, we're creating a brand new concept. In fact, we've already created a brand new concept in cannabis production. We think it's the future of global cannabis production. We have a 800,000 square foot facility at Edmonton International Airport that is a closed system hybrid greenhouse with overpressure, controlling with precision every environmental variable. It is producing cannabis with efficiency like nobody's ever done before on a mass scale with high quality and at ultra low cost per gram. We're doing more of that. We're doubling down on that. We're building another facility the same size, even bigger, 1 million square feet in Denmark. We just announced a week and a half ago that we're building another one, a 1.2 million square foot facility of the same type in Medicine Hat, Alberta. We're changing the world. Canada's changing the world. It's time for a little bit of a measure, a little bit of a victory lap, a little bit of a measure of patriotic pride. And now let's go forward. Let's fine-tune the laws, the tax laws, the packaging laws, which are ridiculous, and all of the retail sales laws that range from government monopoly control in provinces like Ontario and Quebec, which makes no sense and will not succeed in replacing the black market, because we all know that monopolies are really good for everybody, right? But they keep out the small businesses, the entrepreneurs, and the people who come from the cannabis community, the people who've worked so hard and have driven the changing attitudes with respect to cannabis in Canada. There is room for everybody if government will get out of the way, and that's, I think, what the government has to wake up to, both federal and provincial. Thank you very much for your time.